Howdy, all you delicious people. Man, did Marvel just do it again? Man, they just cannot stop doing what they're doing, and they're doing it. They're just doing it. Uh, I'm going to be brutally honest about Marvel M.o.d.o.k, or Marvel M.o.d.o.k series. Really, we have it to where this show to me kind of felt like Deadpool was for the early ons. We end up having reasonably, within a bulk of this story, we do have some Marvel superhero appearances, but really we have to rely much more heavily on M.o.d.o.k and his family, which immediately I groaned about that because I'm like, oh crap, is this what mostly is going to be the show about? Us investing in characters that I could not care a lick about? We end up having several episodes where we end up having to have a whole entire episode catered with the story of M.o.d.o.k and his wife. We have to have episodes catered by M.o.d.o.k and his daughter. We end up having episodes catered to M.o.d.o.k and his goofy son. There are some splashes here or there of Super Marvel or superhero Marvel villains and heroes, and there's sometimes where there's an entire episode with a Marvel superhero in it, which we can thumbs up that, I guess. But I can't help but go through this and like, good God, like Hulu in their Marvel stuff, like anytime I go into a Marvel thing with Hulu attached to it, I'm like, okay, so this is just going to be like the most worst thing possible. Cue us going into a show like Hellstrom, which is actually a Marvel thing that you wouldn't even know. Cloak and Dagger has been on Hulu, I think it was originally in Freeform or some garbage thing like that. Runaways was on here, and what a garbage show that was for the most point. I didn't care for it. I honestly hated it. I thought it was a stupid show. It was. But some people might have liked it. Some people might have liked any of the number of shows that I just mentioned, so I do apologize. But also, M.o.d.o.k is not exactly a show I enjoyed. Through 10 episodes, there were things that I could enjoy about it, but even that was really like wearing very thin for me watching this show. Really, when I get into spoilers, I'm gonna immediately say like what things that I did like about this. Because there are certain villains that appeared on this show where I was like, I like that this person is on here. At least he's incorporated in some kind of part of this show. We end up we end up in this show really having some fun with the Marvel-ish like universe, but really looking at it, it's also at the very bottom of the barrel of the Marvel universe, where we end up having certain characters that really don't have much real true name value, but they are still in the Marvel universe for the most point. Because we have like an entire episode with a cluster of villains that are to be named Armadillo, uh, Melter, Agnar, uh, Pound Cakes. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, like those. Yeah, like those are the people that they rolled up all in one episode and had them being showcased. And here's the funny thing, folks. So we end up having those heroes eventually having some importance onto a following episode, which I thought was just like, that makes no sense. Like making a unimportant character just a person that carries the end of the, and plus like they weren't even trying towards the end of this series. Like it felt very obvious that they were just like, well, like this show is wrapping up, so let's put like the least effort into this. In all honesty, uh, like they were just trying to figure out a way to like skirt their way out of this show. In all brutal honesty, really to see at the end credits, like robot chicken like people, I'm assuming, were attached to this show. Here's my thing. For people who do not know, there is a YouTube batch of videos called Marvel Superheroes What the. That honestly is a much more hilarious and funny show to watch. If you have not seen that yet, definitely go out of your way to finally check that out. That series is actually hilarious, and it is way better than anything that this show was to provide. Really, to me, there was a bunch of stuff where I thought that this show was just blatantly wasting time. I was waiting for more Marvel superhero things to show up in the show, and I was just left wanting a lot more from this show, and it gave me nothing, in all honesty. Or nothing to the point of me going like, wow, like, there is not really one and true fight scene really much in this entire show, with the exclusion of a little thing here and there. Really, we have it to where a lot of the times we end up having AIM being bought and sold like it's nobody's business. And yeah, it's just a like overall just a bore of a show. Because it has to rely not only on M.o.d.o.k but his family. And I was just like, could we honestly just get some kind of something where it ties M.o.d.o.k into into the Marvel universe somehow? Oh, more family crap? Oh, that's great. Thanks, appreciate it. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say for this review of Marvel's M.o.d.o.k. Just a clear disappointment to me, even though some people could go through this show and find something funny, fun, whatever. I just went through this and I was just like, what a waste. What, honestly, what a waste to have like all of these resources and like this is what you did with them. Like you had it to where there are some cool things in here, but that's like 5% cool things, 90% just a lame duck to do with them. Uh, like it's just such a disappointing show overall. So by and large, I think now it's about that time to just kind of scroll through these episodes, try to quickly talk about all of them, and call it a day. Because yeah, I just like eventually once I started to see like how this show was like going to plop out, I was like, I'm just gonna watch this entire season and just be done with it. Like I didn't want to trickle out one episode after the other. Like I just wanted to watch it and bash it all out on one point. Because immediately once I saw season one, I'm like, or immediately when I saw episode one, I'm like, I'm just gonna bash this whole thing out as quickly as possible. Plus, it also helped that a lot of these episodes weren't even 30 minutes. So I was like, okay, so I can easily just watch this entire season in one fell swoop. So let's go into the spoiler territory. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this season. It's been a while since I've covered an entire season of a show. So let's go on to here. So at the very beginning of the show, we end up having M.o.d.o.k who ends up finding Iron Man. Iron Man only appears seemingly twice in this show, I believe. There might be more than that. But yeah, Iron Man appears on this show. We end up having M.o.d.o.k who is to seemingly fight with Iron Man. And we end up having Iron Man who does not really give a rip about really even fighting crime anymore or doing whatever. Like he's watching like some kind of Bake Off or something on like his viewing screen. We end up having M.o.d.o.k going like, dude, are you seriously like watching some kind of Bake Off show instead of actually fighting me? And And Tony is like, well, yeah, like, really, I've kind of downed myself to only watching like 2 episodes a day, so I can kind of catch up. So we eventually have it to where Iron Man is to kick M.o.d.o.k so hard with his foot that bizarrely we have Iron Man who ends up losing his boot, his Iron Man boot. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is taking the entire episode to relish in the fact that M.o.d.o.k had won something, which was just Iron Man's boot from Iron Man. Whoop-a-dee doopity. So we go on in this episode and we end up finding out that it seems that people are not really liking the progress of what M.o.d.o.k has made. Some people have been really disappointed in AIM about what M.o.d.o.k has really done. So we end up finding out that it seems that M.o.d.o.k has also really been really overspending in the AIM company to the point of we end up eventually having it to where M.o.d.o.k is eventually trying to sell AIM off, trying to figure out like how to best save the AIM company. And so we just have a normal, common, everyday Joe guy named Austin who ends up coming in and buying this whole company. And we end up having it eventually where also M.o.d.o.k is now not going to be like the owner of AIM. And so we end up having it to where eventually M.o.d.o.k is to eventually go to dinner with his wife. And we end up having it to where we end up having M.o.d.o.k and Jody having this conversation, and Jody just decides, you know what? I want a separation. I want a divorce. I want to leave you. And so, really, that is to what is to happen within this first episode. For the bulk of it, it's just like it's a lot of that. So in the next episode, we end up having really M.o.d.o.k trying to rekindle the past of M.o.d.o.k and Jody. We end up having it to where it seems when M.o.d.o.k is moving out of his home, we end up having Jody kind of remembering some bits and pieces of their past, evidently some music CDs, and we end up having M.o.d.o.k who's trying to desperately figure out some way to get him to stay in this home. Like something as simple as a CD could hope that he could stay in the home just a little bit longer, like 3 seconds longer or whatever. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k wanting to take Jody back in time to the concert that they missed. The Third Eye Blind concert that they supposedly missed. And so we end up having both M.o.d.o.k and Jody ending up going back in time to actually go back to the wrong time. And so we end up in this episode having the younger M.o.d.o.k noticing his older self and realizing how poorly M.o.d.o.k has aged and how reasonably M.o.d.o.k isn't the conqueror that he thought he would be at that age. And so we end up having M.o.d.o.k, the younger M.o.d.o.k, going on to try and correct his older self, try to correct where his older self had gone. Bop, 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 bop. But so eventually we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is eventually go and teleport both him and Jody into the right time to where they end up making to this Third Eye Blind concert. They end up dancing it out, but it just doesn't seem like this is going to completely and utterly keep both Jody and M.o.d.o.k together. So moving along, we end up having M.o.d.o.k who ends up going to a Grembo leadership conference, we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up having to forcibly take his kids along because he needs to watch his kids. And so we have it to where M.o.d.o.k is to eventually try and figure out how he can win over some of his co-workers and some of his some of these people that are kind of higher ups. And so we end up having it to where eventually we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is to kind of ask his daughter for advice, and it seems that M.o.d.o.k's daughter, who is Melissa, is kind of giving him some advice on how to talk to certain people, and every little bit of that is working. But it doesn't seem to kind of really win everyone over, and so we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who's trying to look for the quick fix. And so eventually M.o.d.o.k ends up going and thinking, like, well, maybe I can channel some kind of other dimensional being and have them come here and then defend these people from this onslaught of these creatures, and then I will like completely win them over. So we have it to where in this episode we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up calling upon the uh, these Marvel characters called the Brood, and he ends up trying to channel them over to this dimension, but instead we end up having seemingly some goofy looking alien creatures that he has a goofy, bizarre name for them and doesn't make sense, and then end up coming over onto their plane, and we have M.o.d.o.k who's like, well, like, I like, this wasn't the thing that I wanted here. I wanted the Brood. And so we end up having these alien-esque like characters that look kind of a mix of like a snail and a turtle person going and having a party with these people, with these coworkers, with whatever. And so we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up going to the Brood's planet, and it seems that that the Brood were wiped out by these things. And so we have it to where M.o.d.o.k eventually goes and realizes that these aliens are aliens that tend to party way too hard, to the point of killing every single one of these people off one by one in some way or another, telling them to party way too hard to where they snap their backs or they drink too hard or they whatever and they die. So we go on to eventually desperately having M.o.d.o.k needing to figure out how to exactly take these things down, and we eventually have it to where, of course, M.o.d.o.k ends up, of course, figuring that out. We end up having it to where reasonably M.o.d.o.k ends up turning every single one of these aliens against one another, and they all take off their shell protective things, to where we end up having M.o.d.o.k eventually blasting all of these aliens to kill them all off. So really, it was just a very goofy episode. That was just a really just stupid episode. But we're gonna get a lot of that. So we go on to the very next episode. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is trying to, and here's where we get some pretty decent Marvel characters being dipped into this episode. So in episode 4, we end up having M.o.d.o.k trying to get into a club of supervillains, and we end up having the supervillains not wanting M.o.d.o.k to come because he is not villainous enough. We end up having Mr. Sinister, the leader, who of course people might know like the Hulk, the leader, and we have like Madame Mask, I believe, who is an Iron Man villain. We end up having the leader who's like, dude, you're not villain enough, and you need to come up with some kind of qualification for us to let you in. And M.o.d.o.k is like, well, what do you want me to do? And the leader goes, well, like, you need to go into Avengers Tower and steal Captain America's shield. And M.o.d.o.k is like, how am I supposed to get that away from Captain America, like, I know how much he loves that shield. Like, there's no way I can get that away from him. So, we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is forced to go to this place called the Bar with No Name, where we are to have him meet these kind of low bottom villains, which I've already named off, like the Melter, the Pound Cake, the Angar, the Armadillo, and all kinds of other goofy 10-pin bizarrish villains that make no sense. So we we have M.o.d.o.k, who ends up going to this bar, and he's like, you know what I could probably do? I could probably take every single one of these villains, get together, and have them come with me to the Avengers Tower and take Captain America's shield from him with this team. So we have M.o.d.o.k, who ends up coming up with this plan. Hey guys, how about we all go and steal Captain America's shield? And they're like, yeah, that sounds great. But we end up sadly having it to where Tenpin doesn't have his pins with him, and so they have to go and trade some kind of bizarrish uh, God, what is it called? Like some kind of bizarrish axe of sorts or something. It looks really, really bizarre. And we end up having it to where eventually they end up evenly trading this out. And so bizarrely, this store owner is consistently licking the blades of this device. And we eventually have it bizarrely where like he is starting to get angry with the people, and he is starting to chop off his own like finger, hand, everything to show them like, hey, uh don't go roughhousing in here, or I'm going to do this to you. And he chops off his own hand, or chops off his own tongue, or chops off any number of things bizarrely. And so we eventually have all the villains who end up going off to eventually have uh oh, and we also have bizarrely M.o.d.o.k with some sidekick. uh I think that his name is Adaptoid. Yeah, kind of like an annoying, almost Jarvis-y like character, but like I actually like Jarvis, where I could care less for this Adaptoid like villain, or this Adaptoid sidekick. Really, he's just kind of there to just like become a car or become some kind of device that M.o.d.o.k is to need, like a toaster or a smoothie or an alarm clock or whatever. It's a bizarrish character that just becomes whatever M.o.d.o.k needs in whatever episode. So we eventually have it to where these guys are to uh, go on to this subway, and we end up having all the villains ending up falling asleep on the subway, and they just decide that they no longer, like M.o.d.o.k just decides that they no longer are going to go and try to get Captain America's shield, because eventually the Adaptoid car ends up getting stolen by some people, and so we end up having forcibly the villains all going on a subway, which they end up just falling asleep. We end up having all the villains who end up just going to a beach with one another and talking about how like M.o.d.o.k did have this plan of getting Captain America's shield, and that it only would have cost them two of these villains, and really like everybody kind of laughed at that. They're like, man, what a great plan that would have been. Like, yeah, it would have been a great plan. So we end up having eventually everybody just starts to walk off from this beach, and we end up having Melter that is still sticking around. We end up having M.o.d.o.k who ends up kind of like poking at Melter, and Melter ends up falling over to show us that Melter is now dead. So a guy that we barely knew and we never actually got to see his powers, he is now just dead. So with the next episode, I'm gonna have to pause here. Okay, I wanted to just kind of break this down because I'm like, okay, like what happens in this next following episode? Because I'm like, I know everything that happens with everything else, but I was like, is this stupid crappy episode where they just do this like Civil War reenactment pretty much, and that's basically what they do with this episode. So we end up bizarrely having in this episode, we end up having M.o.d.o.k's son who ends up wanting to become a magician. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is seemingly tied to the Asgardians in here, because we end up having both Lou and M.o.d.o.k who end up being sucked into this trash can, which ends up leading them to Asgard, to where we are to have Balder kind of commanding these Asgardians that they know that they need to go and figure out how to bottleneck this portal that is arriving in Asgard, because they're getting all kinds of things dumped into Asgard, and we eventually have it to where Balder, who eventually ends up getting a like a fax machine or a copier getting dumped onto his head, and that ends up just killing him off. So we go on to eventually having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up just taking these Asgardians and trying to order them and tell them what to do. And eventually we end up having, at points in time, that these Asgardians are in some tent doing this almost Civil War reenactment like thing, to where they're just kind of roughing it and whatever. We end up having Lou, who ends up going with these goblins. And so we eventually end up having it to where really it just ends up to where M.o.d.o.k and Lou have to just face one another for the fate of the Asgardians and the goblins. And so we end up having it to where Lou's idea is just to perform a magic trick to make it look like M.o.d.o.k is dead, and everyone, I believe, eventually just falls for it. And because we end up having Lou doing a trick where he is to cut M.o.d.o.k in half with obviously fake legs on one side. But eventually we end up having it to where reasonably everyone falls for it, and everybody's like, oh, well, Lou won. And yeah, so like eventually that's just the way that stupid episode just kind of concludes. I thought that this was probably the worst. Any heavily used Lou episodes are probably the worst episodes, because I hate that character. It was like the family for the most point is like, if M.o.d.o.k isn't to be shown to just be a just stupid character, not like stupid haha funny. No, he's just blatantly a stupid character. Like his family is just cringe. Like his family is so utterly cringe, it's ridiculous. And I'm like, God, like you could have at least given M.o.d.o.k a like super powered, superhuman, whatever family, and I would have liked that a lot better. Because then you could have played around with superpowers, and you could have accidentally just like, say if somebody had like flame superpowers, then like you could have made a ton of jokes about that, and you could have gone with any number of things. Like if this family would have had superpowers, every single one of them, because Melissa does have powers like her father, where she looks just like M.o.d.o.k. Like if this whole family would have had some kind of superpower thing with them, I thought that would way better sell the show than just M.o.d.o.k and a bunch of just family members that I could care less about. So moving on. So going into the next episode, we end up having it to where we end up having Wonder Man in this episode, and I was like, yeah, like thank God, because one, we actually have Nathan Fillion as Wonder Man, and some people may not have known, Supposedly in a Guardians of the Galaxy movie, they were desperately trying to make Nathan Fillion Wonder Man in one of those movies, but it just did not pan out. Like there are at points in time some screenshots of stuff that they did try to do somewhere, but it never actually came to fruition. Maybe in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, maybe they will have a Wonder Man in Guardians of the Galaxy, because I think that would actually be a fun character to have. Uh, like maybe as another hero, sidekick, whatever thing. I'm assuming it wouldn't be a villain because that would make sense. But hopefully they have Wonder Man in a Guardians of the Galaxy movie. That would actually be really, really fun. So going into this, we end up having Wonder Man who ends up picking up Jody, and it seems that Jody evidently now becomes a novelist since she had broken up with M.o.d.o.k. And so we end up having both Wonder Man and Jody meeting at some bookstore of sorts, and we end up having Wonder Man saying, "Oh my God, like I absolutely love this book, and it just so happens to be Jody's." We end up having bizarrely Wonder Man who's like, "Yeah, like I would buy this movie and to get and give it to every woman that I respect." And so eventually we end up finding out that that reasonably eventually Jody ends up going with Wonder Man on a date, and then eventually she ends up realizing that it is Wonder Man. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that there are paparazzi consistently following around Wonder Man, and we end up having Jody who ends up going and realizing, like, hey, I can use this to my advantage. Like, I can try to sell my book like crazy now that I'm tied to some real celebrity, which is Wonder Man. And so we basically have like Jody like dancing in front of the camera. We end up having Jody who is going in swimsuits with Wonder Man, so that way like she can like really just also try to like promote herself, but also promote her book, yada yada yada. So we eventually have it to where M.o.d.o.k is trying to realize that Jody is finding this Wonder Man. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that Jody and Wonder Man are invited to this party, and so is M.o.d.o.k. So M.o.d.o.k is trying to better himself. He's trying to get a haircut, a new set of clothes, and everything like that because uh, he realizes how uh, different that he is from Wonder Man, and how Wonder Man, like his butt and his whatever, is so like wow amazing. So we end up eventually having M.o.d.o.k who ends up showing up at this party too, to eventually show up with a different look, seemingly Botoxed up to the gills and so on and so forth. So we have to where it seems that Wonder Man and M.o.d.o.k are eventually like trying to trying to almost get into a fight with one another. We end up having Wonder Man who's mentioning like, yeah, it seems like me and Jody are having like the best love making session that I think she's ever had. And Wonder Man's mentioning like, yeah, and like I've told your kids that like they can call me dad or daddy whenever they want. And so like Wonder Man is saying all these things to tick M.o.d.o.k off. So we eventually have it to where M.o.d.o.k and Wonder Man are desperately wanting one or the other to throw the first punch. M.o.d.o.k is like, yeah, like, please just hit me so that way you'll look bad in front of my wife. And Wonder Man's like, no, I wouldn't have thought to do that. But eventually they just keep butting heads over and over and over again to the point where eventually we end up having Wonder Man who ends up starting to beat up M.o.d.o.k, and then M.o.d.o.k ends up getting into a bloody mess, and then so eventually Wonder Man ends up leaving. We end up having Jody telling M.o.d.o.k, it's like, well, hey, like, like go and get out of here. But before you do, could you take a picture of you and my book and then post it on Instagram? Like mother, like like Jody's even sponging M.o.d.o.k on trying to promote uh to promote Jody's book, which is just ridiculous. So so we end up on the fairly next episode. We eventually have M.o.d.o.k, who is to seemingly have Jody seemingly run back to M.o.d.o.k, and we end up having it to where it seems like they are seemingly making passionate love with one another, and eventually we end up having the kids who are consistently coming in and bringing food for M.o.d.o.k to eat. To where eventually we end up having M.o.d.o.k is like, dude, I need to go to the bathroom, and Jody's like, yeah, go ahead. Like I've soundproofed the bathroom so you can make all kinds of god awful sounds, like you're dying in there, and it'll be perfectly fine. And so we find out that Jody and Melissa and Lou had been kidnapped and had been taken by M.o.d.o.k's past self. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is eventually just having the time of his life with his seemingly other family, and we have it to eventually bizarrely M.o.d.o.k and family are like going into bizarrely starting a band, and every single one of them all bizarrely look like Prince, and we end up having it to where the real M.o.d.o.k's family are trying to figure out how to tell by message to M.o.d.o.k that these aren't really his family, and so they end up finding out that they can connect somehow to the Roomba that is in M.o.d.o.k's home. And so we eventually have it to where the Roomba is to spell out in certain kind of words the words robot. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is to kind of finish with his band practice with his family, and he ends up going and trying to tilt over to stretch his body. And we end up having Jody, who kind of quickly gets into the way of the words robot. And so we end up having it to where did M.o.d.o.k see it? Did he not see it? And so we start to have this Jody who is starting to malfunction and is telling M.o.d.o.k that he thinks that they should renew their vows. We end up having Jody who ends up bizarrely dropping half of her face off onto the ground, and you obviously see that Jody is now a robot. And we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who's just like, well, like of course, like we'll renew our vows, and then he throws the bit of skin that she has back onto her face, knowing full well that she's a robot, and M.o.d.o.k even realizes that, but he's just too stupid to like. I guess he's just so happy doing what they're doing that he doesn't care if this family is real or fake or robot or whatever. So we eventually go on to have M.o.d.o.k going and having this wedding. And we eventually have it to where all this wedding is just to have them end up uh, seemingly all to be dropped into this location with the real family there and also a bunch of these clones slash robots. So we end up having it to where the younger robot or the younger M.o.d.o.k is to come in with a goal in mind because he has the X-Men villain character who is called Arcade. Some people might know this guy from X-Men. Some people might know him from Deadpool. Some of him might actually know him from a really cool series called Avengers Arena, where he was kind of the main villain in that. But every single incarnation, eventually Arcade would come up with this thing called Murder World, where that's, of course, where Arcade comes up with Murder World in this scenario. We end up having to a reasonably, this Myrtle World is just him like this version is just him tossing uh uh really just uh giant pinballs and whatever. But eventually the main goal is for the M.o.d.o.k family to find out who is the real M.o.d.o.k family member. Who's the right M.o.d.o.k? Who's the right Jody? Who's the right Melissa? Who's the right Lou? So we end up having it to where eventually we end up having Melissa, who ends up finding out that it seems that there are these discs that are inside the fake versions of them. And so we end up having Melissa, who ends up finding the right version of herself. And so we end up having Melissa helping out the others. And so we end up eventually having one of the Lus ending up killing himself. And we end up finding out that that, of course, is the fake Lou. We end up having... we end up having Jody, who I think ends up finding out who she really actually is, and we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up finding who he actually is. And so we end up having it to where everyone finds out who they actually are. Like, I think there was kind of a mistake of like, God, how did you know if that was the fake person or not? Really, we have it to where it seems that for M.o.d.o.k, it was easy to find who the real M.o.d.o.k was, because M.o.d.o.k didn't actually know what Jody's anniversary was, but the other two M.o.d.o.ks knew exactly to the date of what it was. To where Melissa ends up killing both of the robot M.o.d.o.ks because M.o.d.o.k would not have actually known. So we end up having Jody, who is like, well, now we have to figure out like who is the character that is going to tell the truth, the absolute truth, and so that will be the wrong Jody. So eventually they end up killing one of the Jodys off, and everything is answered. We end up having the two Lus who just end up just being a thing, and we end up eventually having it to where M.o.d.o.k is to just stop what they're doing. Because we have a time limit on this thing, and we end up having M.o.d.o.k is like, well, what if we just run out the time limit? And so we eventually have it to where younger M.o.d.o.k is to eventually go down onto the field to go and fight out this family, and we end up having Jody, who ends up ripping younger M.o.d.o.k in half. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, like, if younger M.o.d.o.k is to die, or if younger M.o.d.o.k is to have anything that changes or shifts or whatever of his past, shouldn't that relate to future M.o.d.o.k somehow? But I guess they just say, well, if two M.o.d.o.ks exist in one reality, I guess past M.o.d.o.k doesn't affect future M.o.d.o.k, I guess. It's so goofy. So, because we end up eventually having something going on with younger M.o.d.o.k, which we'll talk about later. So we end up having it to where episode 9 is probably the laziest episode. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is like, there's some funny things about it, but a lot of it is just the laziest episode, as well as just kind of wrapping this up and is just the laziest way too. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up going to a graveyard and is trying to figure out what is his next step to do. What should he do? And we end up having a numerous amount of people that are all talking about change or that they should do something different. We have two people just humping away in this graveyard, and we have one girl who's like, "Yeah, we should change it up. We should like switch different positions. Like this is getting like boring. This is getting stale." And so we end up having numerous people kind of in some way or another talking about some kind of change of sorts, and we eventually have it to where M.o.d.o.k realizes, yeah, like that's what I should do. New. I should do something new. And so we have M.o.d.o.k who ends up going to the uh who ends up going to the M.o.d.o.k AIM company, and we end up having M.o.d.o.k who is to seemingly be the most perfect employee there, to where we end up having Austin and Monica, who eventually becomes the sorcerer supreme, because eventually we end up having a whole entire thing where Monica is to eventually had gotten a job from M.o.d.o.k, and Monica had been uh, ushered in this by M.o.d.o.k, and to where eventually we had like a whole scene where we're going through and showcasing younger Monica, because Monica is Scientist Supreme, but she doesn't actually look like Scientist Supreme exactly. In like Scientist Supreme, a visual that I'm fairly known with. Like they kind of go and do some other kind of possible variation of Scientist Supreme, but it is what it is. So we end up eventually having Austin, who is consistently getting uh, kind of scared by his superiors, like these superiors that are all like like three clouds of people all tied into one. It looks fairly bizarre. So we go on and we end up having M.o.d.o.k being such a good employee that everybody's just kind of concerned, and to where eventually we end up having M.o.d.o.k, who is to be doing so well that we end up having Austin, who ends up giving him like the latest invention of AIM. So we go on to eventually have M.o.d.o.k, who is to go on and try to figure out how he can be the best employee of AIM, to where eventually we end up having uh, Scientist Supreme and her daughter kind of infused in this story every once in a while. And so we end up having the Scientist Supreme, who's just kind of really paranoid, and we eventually have it to where Austin is to take him and his dog to hide off. And I think Austin is kind of a funny character at some points in time. He ends up doing a lot of stupid stuff, but it also is kind of funny every once in a while. But we end up having Austin, who ends up hiding into this pod, and we end up having Monica, who ends up getting so scared that M.o.d.o.k might be in this pod that eventually, once this pod opens, we end up finding out that Austin had been infused with his dog to be this man dog creature. So, like, I guess they tried to steal this idea from, like, the Jeff Goldblum movie, The Fly. So we eventually have a bunch of Monica's robot like things go and attack Austin to eventually just repetitiously just shoot Austin, but he actually doesn't die. So we end up just having this dog Austin character through the rest of the show for reasons that don't make sense to me. And then eventually we end up having really M.o.d.o.k, who ends up deciding to bring in his arch nemesis to help him try to buy out AIM. We end up having Iron Man coming in to buy out AIM. We end up having M.o.d.o.k, who ends up selling all his shares to Iron Man, and we have Iron Man who ends up coming in and eventually buying out uh, Monica's shares. So that way, we end up having Iron Man who ends up getting the most control out of this company, and we end up having M.o.d.o.k who ends up giving Iron Man the latest gadget of AIM as a kind of like, hey, go ahead and sell this. So we end up having to where Iron Man is telling like what all that these people are to do now and to not be villainish people. And we end up having Iron Man who is promoting this gadget with Wonder Man, and we eventually have it to where it seems that this gadget is to eventually put off pheromones for all of these animals and attack both Iron Man and Wonder Man. And eventually, this is kind of just how this episode goes off. So we push on, and so we end up having Lou, who is having a bar mitzvah of sorts, and so it seems that nobody is really wanting to come to Lou's bar mitzvah. Lou doesn't have any friends. We end up having M.o.d.o.k who ends up trying to hire friends to go to Lou's party, and nothing is quite working out. And so we end up instead just having M.o.d.o.k who ends up just hiring a bunch of the villains and a bunch of just everyone that he has encountered with throughout this entire show. This is like the huzzah huzzah kind of party. And so we eventually have it towards seems that the younger M.o.d.o.k arrives yet again in this giant robot suit to eventually fire off rockets into the M.o.d.o.k family. And then everything just stops, and the younger M.o.d.o.k is to tell the older M.o.d.o.k, hey man, like, there was a reason why I did all of this. And because every single timeline that M.o.d.o.k had been in, he had eventually been defeated by the Avengers. Every time M.o.d.o.k would stroll into the Avengers Tower, he would be taken down by every single Avenger possible. Captain America would shuck a shield into M.o.d.o.k's face. Thor would shuck the Mjolnir into M.o.d.o.k's face. Hawkeye would or Black Widow would do her thing to take down M.o.d.o.k, and even Hawkeye would shoot arrows into M.o.d.o.k's face. Every single Avenger, with the exclusion of, I guess, Hulk, because I guess they couldn't figure out what to do with Hulk, M.o.d.o.k would have died from. And so, yeah, M.o.d.o.k is like, dude, I even would have been even beaten by, like, Hawkeye? And younger M.o.d.o.k said yes. So we end up having it to where eventually we're doing like the Avengers Endgame thing, to where eventually younger M.o.d.o.k is like, well, yeah, I went into every single reality, and it seems that there is a reality where you did win. You were conquerors. You were the Emperor M.o.d.o.k or whatever. And so we end up having it to where the only way for M.o.d.o.k to be able to become superior Emperor M.o.d.o.k whatever is to have his family die, because his family were to have cost him being the emperor. And so we end up having younger M.o.d.o.k who is telling older M.o.d.o.k, hey, I am going to kill your family for you because I do not know this family, and you do. So I am going to kill off your family for you so you can become a much greater M.o.d.o.k. And so we end up having M.o.d.o.k is like, no, you can't do it. And he's like, yeah, I can. I easily can. So we end up having M.o.d.o.k younger M.o.d.o.k who ends up killing M.o.d.o.k's family, and then M.o.d.o.k becomes Emperor M.o.d.o.k. And so M.o.d.o.k ends up going and checking on younger M.o.d.o.k, who is now uh, strapped to some wall where we are to have older M.o.d.o.k try and figure out if there is a way for M.o.d.o.k to still get his family back somehow. There has to be some way. And and younger M.o.d.o.k is like, dude, you're just wasting your time. And so we have it to where this younger M.o.d.o.k is some anomaly. There we go. And so really, I guess this M.o.d.o.k will not conflict with older M.o.d.o.k. If younger M.o.d.o.k is to die, it won't matter because I guess there's some rip in the timeline to where like this other M.o.d.o.k doesn't exist at all. So going into this, we have seemingly we end up having M.o.d.o.k who is to uh, the younger M.o.d.o.k who's having all these crystals attached to his head, and every single one of these crystals end up crumbling, bursting, whatever, to end up having this younger M.o.d.o.k die. To where we end up having M.o.d.o.k realizing it that there is no way that they can look further to see if M.o.d.o.k's family could exist, but M.o.d.o.k is still stubbornly wanting to find a way for his family to still exist. And that is just the way the show ends. So, with that said, yeah, this is just, it was what it was for this show. I really just did not care for it, but there were some things that I liked about the show. I liked Arcade being put into this show because I immediately was like, oh, I was excited about Myrtle World. But eventually, once this Myrtle World played out, I'm like, ugh, this sucked. I liked the fact that we end up having some villains infused in this story, and we actually had Iron Man infused in this story, not once but twice. But really, it was just like clearly not enough. Clearly, I was just very disappointed in this show, and clearly, I was just like, man, this just sucks. Like, Marvel's Superhero What the was a much better series than this, and you have it to where this is done by a higher rung of people. Like we end up having to where like Seth Green and all of his people ended up doing a number of like DC like movies and stuff like that, which I thought that those things were so fun and so comedic and so like man were those shows good. And I come in here and I'm like, God, this sucks. Like this is not really using the whole Marvel landscape of things, like, and have a lot of like Marvel jokes about things. No, it's just like the bottom of the barrel and very Deadpool-esh of the Marvel universe, where it's like you get little Marvel characters here and there, but it just overall just sucked for me, in all honesty. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.